All right, this is a tutorial on curved piecing. This is very basic. We're going to make a 6.5 inch drunkard's path block, which is a quarter circle. And if you want to see the cutting instructions for this block, we are using the Classic Curves ruler to do the cutting, and the full instructions for the entire process from cutting all the way through piecing is on the previous video. This video only includes the piecing aspect of it if you're having difficulty with curved piecing. Okay, so I've got my convex shape and my concave piece, and we're ready to sew them together. Okay, let's piece these two together. First of all, take one of your fabrics and fold it in half, bringing the two ends of the curve together, and crease it in the middle to mark the center. You can't really see that probably on the video, but there's a crease in the center there. And then I'm going to fold the ends of the curve in and crease those points too on each side. And that gives me 3 points on the curve plus the two ends. And I'm going to do the same thing with the other piece, only this time I'm going to match those points as I find them. So I'll crease that. Can you see a little better on the white fabric that there's a crease there? And I'm going to match that up with the first fabric. Okay, and then fold the outside edge in, find that point, and match it up with the crease on the first fabric, and pin that as well, and also the end. Okay, same thing on the other side. Bring one end of the curve into the center and pinch it to crease and match that up with the crease on the first fabric. I need a pin cushion, don't I? It's sometimes hard to get them out of these little containers. Okay, and then also the ends of that curve. And you'll notice that I'm making sure that the straight sides of my pieces match and are square. You don't want to do it so that they're crossing like that or so that they're at any kind of angle. Manipulate your fabric enough that you get nice straight lined up edges. Okay, so that's going to be that piece, and now it's ready to sew. Okay, are we ready to sew this curve? Here we go. I have my sewing machine set on 1/4 inch for seam allowance, and I've got my piece that I just pinned here. And first of all, I am going to just put that end in just like I ordinarily would, put my presser foot down. Okay, so first of all, just sew a couple of stitches, and I'm going to set my machine at needle down so that it makes it easy to adjust and stop as I approach pins or if I need to turn the fabric. Okay, so I'm going to take that first pin out, and as you can see, I hold the top fabric with my thumb and forefinger here. That allows me to kind of guide it and keep it lined up with the fabric underneath as I sew. Take that pin out. Sometimes you have to use your other hand to kind of flatten out the fabric and keep those edges lined up. You want to be careful that you're keeping your edges lined up, but you're not pulling on the fabric or stretching it at all. I am literally just using the tips of my fingers to guide the fabric through, but not pulling on it. Kind of push that into place and hold that there so that that one lays down flat. Can you see how I stop periodically and to allow the fabric to shift so that I'm not constantly pushing it toward the end with my presser foot? If you stop periodically and you have the needle down, your presser foot rises a little bit and allows the fabric to shift just slightly so that it stays where it's supposed to. Okay, now I have my piece that I just sewed at the ironing board, and I am going to just gently press this, again, without pushing or pulling on it. You don't want to stretch your piece at all. Just kind of set it out there and then use the end of your iron to kind of carefully push it out. I typically like to press my pieces toward the toward the concave shape. I find that the finished blocks lay flatter that way and don't look as bulgy and bulky for some reason. Now, there are going to be situations where you may need to press in toward the convex shape for some reason, but as a general rule, try to press outward and you'll get a nice flat smooth block, nice smooth seam. Okay, so this is my 6.5 inch Drunkard's Path block, and it's ready to add to the others and make into a full-size quilt. Okay, now it is time to trim and square our blocks. Typically we'll sew a whole bunch of blocks, like all the blocks that we need for our quilt, and then go back and trim and square them all at the same time. And what this does is it gives us a chance to make sure that all of our blocks are the same size and have the same amount of seam allowance outside of all of the curved shapes, so that when we go to sew them together, they fit really nicely. Okay, so the key is to make sure that you do them all the same. Some of this is going to depend on your personal preference and the pattern that you're working from. You may want to trim your blocks down to just barely 1/4 of an inch outside of the curve shape so that when you sew them together, they butt right up next to each other and you don't see any of this background fabric at these points. For this particular block, we are going to leave about 1/2 inch to the outside so that when we sew our blocks together, it'll create a circle, but there'll be about 1/4 of an inch of background fabric all the way around. So that's just going to be, that's going to vary depending on the pattern you're working from. Sometimes you may leave more space here if you're wanting more of this fabric to show. Okay, so the first thing to do is take our ruler, place it on the piece, and since my block is 6.5, that's the size that I'm going to trim it to. And what I want you to think about this is that we aren't just going to line up the ruler with 2 sides and then cut the other 2 sides off. What we're doing is cutting a 6.5 inch square basically out of the center of the block that we've sewn. Okay, this one has quite a bit of extra built into the piecing so that you cut about 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch off all the way around, but some of them will be less than that and some you'll barely trim at all. But okay, so here is the 6.5 inch corner on my ruler. Okay, so a couple of things to check very first. Like I said before, I want to leave 1/2 an inch around at the ends of each of the curve. Okay, so I have my 1/2 inch line lined up with where my green and white fabric meet. Okay, the second thing that I want to check is to make sure the amount of fabric that's outside of my 6.5 inch line, which is what I'm going to be cutting off eventually, is pretty uniform around the entire block. So I wouldn't want to have it set like this where I cut a lot off this side and almost none off of this side. I want to have that pretty well centered so that I have around 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch, the same amount on this side and going down here, okay, and around the same amount here and here. Can you see how that's pretty uniform all the way around? So I've got a 1/2 inch to the outside of my curves on each end, and I've got a little over 1/8 inch of fabric to the outside to be cut off. Okay, so let's make those first cuts. And then turn my piece over again and essentially do the same thing, only it's much easier now because I can take my 6.5 inch line and match it up with the edges that I already cut. And you can see again, I've got a 1/2 inch at each end and about 1/8 inch to the outside to cut off. So I know I've got it pretty even. Okay. So as you work through your blocks and you're trimming them all the same way, that will make it so that when you go to sew your blocks together, they are going to fit really nicely. You've got the same amount of fabric here, so you can see when I sew these together, I'm going to get a nice smooth curve all the way around. I can make a full circle, I can make a 1/2 circle, I can do 3/4, a lot of different shapes and twist and turn, and play a lot with the layout. Makes for a really fun, interesting design.